Hi, I'm Walk. These are my Wednesday words on July 22nd. I had so much to say last week that I didn't have an introduction or closing, and several of you said you missed that. I actually thought YouTube would let me close with a slide like the opening title, but apparently the last card has to be a link to another YouTube page. I'm still learning. Next week is the church's Staycation Bible School. Register your elementary age children on the church's website, and anybody in the sound of my voice electronically can use our videos and Bible school. Because Staycation Bible School videos will be posted on the church website next week, I will not have Wednesday words on July 29th. We're moving into the 16th century and really all the way up to the 1800s in the 19th century. It's a very cursory tour of Christian spirituality. It's worth noting that as the Protestant Reformation developed, the Roman Catholic Church went through their own counter-reformation or reformation of its own, that they got better. The Roman Church began to come into the Enlightenment, and much more was done that, as we would recognize today as spirituality, a reform and renewal of communities of men and women, abbeys and monasteries. In the late 1600s and early 1700s, there were many new Christian movements in England. The Anglican Church was strengthened, and from that English mother church, if you will, sprang the Quakers and the Methodists and other groups. You're familiar with them today. You've heard of them. They come from that Anglican tradition. You probably wouldn't know that today. They are so very different. But there are many similarities. Both the Quakers and the United Methodists, the Wesleyans, believe in perfecting humanity through prayer and perseverance. This is the sanctification I talked about last week. George Fox was born in England in 1624 and lived a long life. He heard God speak to him on several occasions and decided to become a preacher, but not an ordinary one, an educated Anglican. He rejected formal training. He lived a tumultuous life as a street preacher and revivalist. He was arrested several times as the political fortunes changed in England, with Cromwell taking over Parliament, then a restoration of the monarchy. It seemed like George Fox and the Quakers were always on the wrong side of power. But he preached boldly and had many followers and did miracles, and he encouraged his followers to practice silence and silent prayer. That's what the Quakers are known for today. George Fox visited Quakers in America, in the Caribbean, the Carolinas, and the Northeast. Later, William Penn would found Pennsylvania and the city of brotherly love. Quakers are pacifists who believed in thoughtfulness and silence, marks we would recognize today as spiritual. John and Charles Wesley were born in Epworth, England, and they founded what we know as the Methodist Church. There was a method to their Christianity, a formula, a way of progressing through Scripture and through life. John Wesley also toured the American colonies, especially South Carolina and Georgia. There are churches in those states today that trace their existence back to sermons preached and visits by John Wesley. But he wasn't really on fire for the gospel then, with a warm heart and a burning passion, until he returned to England and was studying Luther and Luther's commentary on Romans. Remember, it was Romans that showed Martin Luther he was saved by grace through faith and not works. Well, both Wesley brothers had religious experiences within a few days of each other. John was at a prayer meeting on Aldersgate Street in London, and suddenly he was fired up. 100 years after George Fox. Brother Charles Wesley was a great hymn writer. You would recognize some of his 6,000 hymns. Christ the Lord is risen today. Christ whose glory fills the skies. Come thou long expected Jesus. Or perhaps love divine, all loves excelling. What I want you to see is that both these movements, the Methodists and the Quakers, are ones that are around today with an American connection, that are what we would notice as spiritual, an emphasis on quiet prayer and self-improvement, even perfection. Let's skip ahead. There was a great awakening in America that preceded the Revolutionary War. It happened in the 1760s. And then in our new nation, in the early 1800s, there was a second great awakening, a religious revival in America even bigger than the Great Awakening. It started in Cane Ridge, Kentucky in 1801. Settlers had moved across the Appalachian Mountains and started homesteading in southern Ohio, Kentucky, and Tennessee. There were people there, but few churches and pastors. So people didn't hear preaching or have communion very often, if at all. The lack of sacraments caused a yearning in the people for community and for church. That sounds like us today, yearning for community and communion in a time of separation. Pastor Barton Stone at Cane Ridge Presbyterian Church had taken advantage of various networks of communication, especially Methodist and Presbyterian churches and meetings, to circulate the word that at the Cane Ridge sacramental communion would take place. It would be one of the greatest meetings of its kind ever known. Congregations and pastors and people determined not to miss it. They sent out notices in the fledgling newspapers, but mostly it was word of mouth. Colonel Robert Patterson wrote a letter about it afterwards, and I'm quoting, "On the first Sabbath in August was the sacrament at Cane Ridge, the congregation of Mr. Stone. This was the largest meeting of any that I've ever seen. It continued from Friday until Wednesday, about 12,000 persons, 125 wagons, 8 carriages, 900 communicants, and 300 of them were struck down with emotion." He writes about the spectacle. It was amazing. The release folks had who finally got community, communion, preaching, Lord's Supper, baptism. I visited the Cane Ridge Meeting House last fall. It's preserved near Paris, Kentucky. We heard a sermon and then a history lecture. It's a neat place. Out of this revival and movement, with more meetings and more revivals, came many Christian denominations, including the Southern Baptists, the Christian Church, Disciples of Christ, the Cumberland Presbyterian Church, and others. Revival swept across our nation, and there were many new Christian denominations. Within Presbyterianism, we split into old school and new school Presbyterian denominations after this second Great Awakening. We Presbyterians are always dividing and reuniting. We've also birthed a lot of denominations who trace their history back to the early 1800s and these frontier American revivals. I'm almost done, closing out. The early 19th century Protestant Christian spirituality was very revival-based and congregation-based, and it would remain that way until the 1960s. And we'll cover that. The 20th century, revivalism, Pentecostalism, spirituality, especially in America, in 2 weeks. See you then.